Good afternoon, and thank you so much for joining us for another Ask the Alliance. I'm so excited to be here with you today for our Turtles of the Chesapeake presentation with Jim Kauffman. Before we begin, I want to share a few housekeeping notes. Please keep your microphones muted throughout the presentation so that we can hear all the exciting information that Jim is going to be sharing with us today. I'm sure you're going to have a lot of questions during the presentation, and we ask that you comment those in this call chat, or if you're joining us on Facebook, within the comments. And our team is going to be collecting those questions for Jim, and he will be answering them at the end of today's presentation. So before I turn things over to Jim, I just want to give you a quick introduction to the Alliance, in case you're joining us for the first time. The Alliance was founded in 1971, and we're a nonprofit organization that restores the lands and waters of the Chesapeake Bay watershed. Our collaborative and action-oriented approach delivers on-the-ground solutions, technical assistance, and builds capacity to achieve healthier lands and cleaner waters. So for us, we do that by working upstream to build resilience on the land for long-term improvements to water quality within our Chesapeake Bay communities. And we have 4 offices that are strategically placed around the watershed in order to achieve that upstream work. We're headquartered in Annapolis, Maryland, but we have offices in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, Richmond, Virginia, and Washington, D.C. And out of those offices, we do our work through 4 main program areas of agriculture, forest, green infrastructure, stewardship, and engagement. And I think Jim might have a fun 5th program area to share with us a little bit later. So each of those programs is designed to bring much needed solutions to the problems that affect the Chesapeake Bay downstream. And I hope that you're interested in learning more about that work. And if you are, I highly encourage you to visit our website, which is full of a lot of information about our team, our strategy, and our projects that we complete around the watershed. And while you're on the website, I hope that you're interested in getting more involved in our work. Our volunteer and events page on the website will list out a lot of opportunities for you to join us in the field to help plant trees, maintain trees, clean up our neighborhoods with trash cleanups, and so much more. So I hope you'll visit that page on our website to learn more about how you can join us in the field and get involved in this work around the watershed. Finally, if you missed something in the presentation or just want to recap, or maybe you want to share it with your friend, we will be following up tomorrow with a recording in your email inboxes of this presentation. So no worries if there's a resource that Jim shares and you don't have time to take notes, we'll be following up with a recording. So that's it for me. I'm really excited to hand it over to Jim. Jim, take it away.
All right, thank you, Adam. And thanks everybody for joining. This is our last Ask the Alliance of the summer. And in my opinion, I think we saved the best one for last. So I'm here today to talk about turtles, which is one of my favorite subjects to talk about. I'm going to talk about some of the different species that can be found throughout the watershed, some of their life history, a little background on turtles in general, and then talk about some of the things that you can do as private landowners to help manage your property better for turtles and turtle conservation. Let's see if my slides advance here. I knew this was going to happen. There we go.
Hey Jim, your audio did just break up a tiny bit once or twice, so maybe it makes sense just to turn off your camera.
Okay. All right. Nobody wants to look at me anyway, so I'm okay with that. All right. If there's any other problems, Adam, just chime in and let me know. But Adam mentioned earlier about the Alliance and our mission and our vision. And I'm proposing that we amend the mission and the vision a little bit to say that the Alliance brings together communities, companies, and conservationists to improve our lands and waters for turtles. And I think our vision should be clean streams and rivers flowing through resilient landscapes cared for by the people who live, work, and play in the Chesapeake Bay watershed, as well as the turtles that inhabit them. I'm going to make that proposal to Kate and Drew and see what they have to say. And Adam also mentioned, let's see if this is going to work. Try it again. Come on. So it's working fine earlier. Of course, now we're having, there we go. All right. I'm also proposing that we add another pillar to our work, which includes turtle conservation. Again, I don't know if that's going to happen or not, but I'll keep promoting it. Before I get started, I want to add a little bit of a disclaimer. I am not a turtle biologist. I'm not a herpetologist. I'm just someone who, like this kid, likes turtles. So maybe you need to take everything I say with a little bit of a grain of salt. But as far as background on turtles and a little bit about their life history, turtles are reptiles. They're ectotherms, which means that the old term that we used to use for it is cold-blooded, which means that their body temperature is almost exclusively dependent on external sources, heat, the sun, ambient air temperature. And reptiles, the groups of reptiles that are still around today include turtles, lizards and snakes, crocodilians, and the very unique tuatara. And there's a picture there on the bottom right of what a tuatara looks like. It's superficially similar to kind of a large lizard, but it's in its own group. Turtles are an order within the class Reptilia. The order is called Testudines. Most turtles have shells that are made of bone, soft shells obviously being the exception to that. Turtle shells provide protection and shelters. We refer to the top of the shell as their carapace and the bottom of the shell as a plastron. So these shells that are made of bone are covered by individual what we call scutes, which are keratinous structures that cover and protect the bone. Turtles are not able to come out of their shells. I think we've done a pretty good job of educating the public. There's not too many people out there nowadays that still believe that, but at one time that was thought of by some. But their ribs and their vertebrae are actually fused to the underside of their carapace. So the shell is bone, and it is a structure that is part of the turtle. Turtles do have the capacity, and some capacity, to feel tactile stimulation and touch when you touch their shells. So, if you're out catching turtles or find turtles, remember that the shells are a part of their body, and when they're damaged or touched or hit or painted on, these are not good things because they could potentially negatively impact the health of that turtle. In general, turtles are long-lived species, and that's because they're slow to reproduce. They take a long time to get to a reproductive age. And then once they do, they're slow moving. There's not a ton of them on the landscape. They have to find individuals of the other gender, breed, and then they typically have smaller clutch sizes and low survival rates of those young. So they are certainly a species that is quite vulnerable. This is just a diagram that shows the bone structure of turtles. Again, we don't have to dwell on this, but it gives you a good idea of how these structures look, or how they're connected to the shell itself, and how turtles are able to actually pull themselves within their shells to some degree, depending on the species, for protection. This is a photo. Obviously, this is not a species that we have here in the watershed. This is some kind of larger terrestrial land tortoise. But again, it really illustrates what the internal structures and skeletons look like within a general turtle shape. So we have a lot of different turtles within the Chesapeake Bay watershed, and that's because we have a diversity of habitats throughout the watershed. We have turtles that inhabit everything from marine environments to mesic and upland forests. I've listed basically 4 general types of turtles that we can find here. We have terrestrial turtles that live in the woods and forests. They aren't exclusively upland, but they spend most of their lives out of the water, things like our eastern box turtle. We have turtles that are primarily aquatic, like our eastern musk or stinkpot turtle. We have semi-aquatic turtles that kind of split their time between the fields and woods and waters, like a wood turtle. And then we have marine turtles. We have sea turtles that do some nesting kind of in the Delmarva area. I'm not going to touch on sea turtles today, just because as a Pennsylvanian, we don't have coastlines here, and sea turtles are kind of outside of my realm of expertise. So we'll have to get somebody from Maryland or Virginia to cover sea turtles one of these days. But again, the diversity of habitats that we have here is really illustrated by the diversity of different turtle species that we have. I've listed some of the different types of habitat, and just generally speaking, some of the different turtle species we have here that utilize them. They are not all exclusive. There you can see there's quite a bit of overlap. Something like a painted turtle could be found in a river as well as a wet meadow or a big lake, and even in a vernal pool. And when they're dispersing and making overland movements, sometimes you find them in upland areas. So turtles, we have some species that are, I would say, are habitat specialists that can only live in very specific habitats, and we have others that are generalists that share habitat with other species. So we'll go through some of those species. Again, here in Pennsylvania, we have between 12 and 14 different species, depending on how you define species and look at subspecies. But throughout the Bay watershed, I don't know exactly the total number of turtle species that we have, but they are quite diverse. And unfortunately, we're gaining more species because we're seeing the establishment of some non-native turtle species that have been introduced and are now starting to establish populations and reproduce on their own. And we'll get into that a little bit. So now I'm going to just go through individual turtle species, so you can see some pictures, talk a little bit briefly just about what they look like, where to find them, their general life history. And I'm going kind of in order of abundance, or how common the species are and how common it may be for you to come across them when you're out on the landscape. And the first is a turtle that most everybody is familiar with, and this is our eastern painted turtle. This is a very common turtle species. I mentioned earlier about habitat generalists versus specialists. This is certainly a generalist turtle. They do have preferences. You know, they like ponds, they like lakes, they like larger bodies of water with some vegetation and an abundant food supply. But, you know, I've found painted turtles in just about anywhere there's a little bit of water on the landscape. They're usually, when you're seeing them, they're basking, which is they're sitting out on a log or rock or on banks, just trying to warm themselves up and metabolize the food that they've eaten based on whatever the temperature is. And that's pretty common as far as where you're going to find them, either basking or if they're making overland movements, either for dispersal or for egg laying. But you can see here on the bottom right, there's some painted turtle hatchlings, and on the left side are turtles basking on logs. This is just an example of what an eastern painted turtle looks like. On the left is the carapace. You can see they're relatively flat, medium-sized turtle, olive drab coloration. And the plastron on our eastern painteds here are almost completely yellow, and they get their name, or the name is derived from the colorful red to orange patterning on the underside of the exterior of their carapace. The next species is, again, another one that most people are familiar with. This is our common snapping turtle. This is one of the largest freshwater turtles that we have here in the watershed, probably the heaviest, I would imagine. I don't know exactly how big they go, but I think they're, you know, a carapace length of 14 plus inches. The soft shells or red bellies may get a little bigger shell lengthwise, but I don't think anything else is as big or as heavy, I should say, as snapping turtles. They're also habitat generalists. We can find them just about anywhere there's water on the landscape. They have a higher reproductive potential than some of the other turtles because their body size is big, can lay a bunch of eggs. As their name suggests, they can certainly be aggressive. That's kind of their defense strategy. Rather than pulling themselves into their shells or trying to get away, they tend to be aggressive and bite. Snapping turtles in some states, like here in Pennsylvania, you can legally harvest snapping turtles. There are regulations to that. I don't know exactly what they are, but you know, so many at a certain time of year, I believe you need to be licensed to do it. Not something that I've ever had a desire to do is harvest one, but there are people out there that do that. I don't know what the regulations are in some of the other states, but people say that snapping turtle makes a good soup, but I personally like turtles a little too much to try to eat one. So I'll let the others do that. But if you come across a snapping turtle and you do need to handle it, either just to pose for pictures like me and Rob here, or if you're moving across a road or want to get it out of your lawn, these are some tips on just how to properly handle snapping turtles. Again, they can be aggressive. They will bite readily, and it hurts very much. I've been bitten by a few. Luckily, they've been smaller ones, so I still have all 10 of my fingers. If you have a problem with your hands smelling funny, don't handle them, because I think they are the worst smelling of the turtles. But if you find a little one, the hatchlings and the juveniles are often pretty docile. They do not bite, so they're okay to handle. But if you're going to handle a turtle, obviously do it safely. And the big thing I want to stress here is do not pick them up by the tail. These are big, heavy-bodied turtles, and if you're holding them by the tail, you're putting a lot of weight on their spinal column, and it can cause the dislocation of vertebrae and can seriously injure some of these big turtles. So if you're just handling the turtle, you're not planning to harvest it, grab underneath the rear of the carapace, as you can see Rob and I demonstrating here in these pictures. But when you do, you're still not in the clear because they have very large and very sharp claws. So they will try to scratch you, and you still could get a nice wound just from their rear claws when you're holding them like this. Here's just some photos from over the years when I was younger and much thinner, of some different bigger snapping turtles that we've caught out in some wetlands, just to get an idea kind of what they look like, how small they are as hatchlings, and how large they can get as adults. But really interesting, really neat turtles. Again, very common. They can be handled very safely if you know what you're doing. And just another neat species that we have here in our turtle community. Eastern box turtles are the next one. Again, this is another very familiar species. This is a turtle that's very widespread throughout the Bay watershed. They can be locally abundant if there is intact habitat and there isn't impacts from development or from roads or fragmentation. They like what we would call mesic forests, which are kind of middle of the road woods, not real high elevation, dry, rocky stuff, but woodlots, lowland forests, wet meadows, wetlands, areas where they can find enough food. They eat things like snails, slugs, earthworms, pretty much anything that they can grab. Their populations are definitely declining throughout their distribution, even though they have a wide distribution and can be abundant locally within smaller populations. Overall, their populations are in trouble because they're terrestrial turtles, so they're getting hit on roads. Development is reducing habitat, and there's a lot more nest predators on the landscape now than there was historically. Things like skunks, raccoons, opossums, these smaller mesocarnivores that have grown in population numbers due to us creating more edge habitat for them and by removing top tier predators that would have been feeding on these mesocarnivores. It's our most terrestrial turtle. So this is you'd be most likely to come across this turtle in an upland landscape. They have a really interesting defense mechanism. They actually have hinged plastrons where they can close their shell pretty much completely and get their head and all four of their legs and tail within that shell. So it really works well to avoid predation. Males and females are what's called sexually dimorphic, where males can be identified by their red eyes and a concave plastron, where females typically have brown eyes and a flat plastron. Here's an example of the variation in colors and patterns from box turtles. On the left, these are all eastern box turtles. These are all the same subspecies. My understanding is I believe there's 4 subspecies of box turtles throughout the United States, and our eastern box turtle, which is Terrapin carolina, they interbreed. They're geographically isolated, but there is a ton of variation just within that species and within the population. So on the left is a poster illustrating that fact. And on the right are 9 photos that I took of different individual box turtles we were doing a forest inventory project in Maryland. And all 9 of those individual box turtles are within the same population in the same intact forest community. And you can see the distinct variation or distinct patterns and colors of the individuals just within that one population. So that's really interesting. The next turtle is one that people may not be as familiar with, and this is because this is a very aquatic turtle. This is the eastern musk turtle, also called the stink pot. I like the term stink pot better, so that's what I'm going to use from here on out. But this is a fairly common widespread turtle. It's almost like a mini snapping turtle where it's kind of a bottom dweller. It doesn't come out of the water much. It basks occasionally, but it comes out to lay eggs, obviously. But most of the time, these are underwater bottom dwelling turtles that are in slow moving, muddy waters, so they aren't seen that often. Occasionally, an angler will catch one that you're fishing for catfish or have a worm or something else on the bottom. And unfortunately, these little guys sometimes will bite on the hook and you'll reel them in. But they get their name from a secretion or substance that they can excrete, which it has a smell to it, but it's not as bad as snapping turtles. I think snapping turtles still smell worse than stink pots. There are some areas to the south of me here where there are eastern mud turtles within the watershed. I don't have a slide in here about mud turtles, but mud turtles and musk turtles look superficially similar and could be confused. But just wanted to point out that we have the musk turtles and mud turtles both within the watershed. And I just have two pictures here. There's something that's really unique and cool about stink pots. They're not bright and brilliantly colored like a lot of other turtles, but they're these cryptic things that have kind of their own personality, their own unique look. They're hiding out in the margins of these waters, on the bottoms of lakes and ponds, slow moving creeks. So you don't see them very often, but they're really neat, really unique looking turtles. I think these are both captive individuals because they're very clean. A lot of times captive individual turtles don't have the algae and other growths on the back of their carapace like wild turtles do. But again, just really neat looking, unique, interesting turtles. Another one that may be observed a little more than stink pots is our northern or common map turtle. And this is a species that resides in bigger, I would call it a big river turtle. I see these guys a lot within the Susquehanna and Juniata River basins here in Pennsylvania. If you're ever floating those big rivers, you'll see these guys basking on rocks and logs and other structures sticking out of the rivers. They're obviously named for the map-like patterns on their shells. The bottom left picture is a pile of map turtles at Presque Isle, Lake Erie. The small hatchling was one that came out of Juniata River, and the one on the right is just an internet photo that shows that hardened beak that map turtles have, and they use that. They eat a lot of clams and mussels. They also eat fish, invertebrates, worms, but they use those hard beaks to crack open those mussels and clams. They're fairly common in these big water systems, but their nesting habitat is very critical. If you think of the Susquehanna and the Juniata River, where these things reside, there are major highways on both sides of those rivers for a significant stretch of them. And these turtles obviously are safe in their basking habitat, safe in the rivers, but once they need to come out and lay eggs, they're impacted by the roads, unfortunately. Females versus males, they have some size dimorphism. Here's another internet photo that illustrates the difference between male map turtles and female map turtles. The female is the one in the center and males are on the periphery. So females get quite a bit bigger than males. Another big aquatic species that we have is the northern red-bellied turtle and northern red-bellied cooter. On the left, you can see a big individual that Rob and I captured. We were floating the Shenandoah River in Virginia. And on the bottom left, a hatchling of red belly. So it always amazes me that these little turtles are born and they're the size of a dime or a quarter, and they eventually grow to pretty big sizes. But the red belly is threatened here in Pennsylvania because we're at the northern limit of its range. But when we see them, they're typically basking, again, on a rock or log, or even on these guys bask on the banks a little bit more than some of the other species. But they're interesting because they're primarily herbivorous. They don't eat as much meat and carrion and invertebrates as some of the other species. Now, if you live within a coastal community or you're down on the bay itself, the Diamondback Terrapin is probably a turtle that you're familiar with. I think this is the most representative of a coastal bay species. They have a very wide distribution. They can be found from New England all the way down around Florida, even over into the Gulf Coast. They inhabit brackish tidal waters and estuaries. Their populations have really declined for a number of reasons. Again, anybody that's ever been to the beach in these coastal communities know that development is very significant, and hasn't slowed much, even into present times. There's a lot of roads throughout their habitat that they need to cross to go from their day-to-day habitat over to where they're going to lay eggs. At one time, terrapins were considered a delicacy, and they were actually harvested and for human food. And they were impacted by bycatch within crab pots, which luckily now there's a bunch of conservation and restoration programs. One of the things that they're doing is they put these, I think they're called like TEDs, a TED, a turtle excluder device on these crab pots. I don't believe it's legal to harvest them in any states. I'm not 100% on that. But some other groups are doing things like once they find a roadkill female, they're removing eggs and then incubating the eggs, raising those hatchlings till they're a little bit bigger, which they call head starting, and releasing back into the wild, and also putting predator excluders over nests to protect the eggs. And terrapins are really interesting because they have a ton of variation. They're similar to box turtles, where individuals, even within the same population, can look very different and have a lot of unique colors and patterns. So really, really cool turtle. The next is the spotted turtle. This is probably my favorite turtle. It depends on the day. I kind of go back and forth between a couple species, but there's just something really cool and really unique about spotted turtles. And, in my opinion, they're just very beautiful. These are smaller semi-aquatic turtles. They're very cryptic. They're secretive. They're hard to find. They really like, if you think like scrub, shrub, wetlands, but they're in swamps. They'll be in wet meadows, sometimes in bog turtle habitat. They really like using vernal pools, and they'll use the adjacent uplands once those vernal pools dry up. They're one of the first turtles to become active in early spring. Sometimes you can even see them moving around under ice in some of these vernal pools. And they're a very seasonal movement species. So they can be susceptible to, again, development impacts to buffer areas where there's forests and uplands adjacent to their wetland habitat. And they're also very sought after for the pet trade. So unfortunately, they are illegally collected, again, because they're beautiful turtles. The wood turtle, again, is another one of my favorites. This is, I think, a good way to describe this species is it's a riparian species. It's typically found in conjunction with creeks and with rivers. It will forage both in and out of the water. Wood turtles actually hibernate underwater in deep pools of these creeks. And if you're ever floating a creek like we were here on the left, occasionally you'll see them pop up next to your kayak, or you'll see them basking on rocks and logs. These guys are really susceptible to a lot of impacts on land because of their overland terrestrial upland movements. They get hit by cars, they're impacted by farming practices, and obviously development and just general loss of habitat. So their populations, unfortunately, have been declining. Bog turtle is a turtle that most people are familiar with, or at least have heard of, but very few have actually seen. This is a turtle that's significantly imperiled, mostly because it's a habitat specialist, and the habitats that it resides in have been significantly impacted by draining, by pond creation, and by development. So they're called bog turtles, but I'm not going to say they're not in bogs, because there are some parts of their range where they are found in some higher elevation bogs, but they typically like what we would refer to as a fen wetland. And these are open emergent wetlands that have very few trees or little canopy cover. And those wetlands, they require deep, mucky soils, and the bog turtles rely on groundwater discharge and spring-fed hydrology. They are federally threatened. They're endangered in Pennsylvania. I'm not sure their status in some of the surrounding states. But again, it's these wetlands that they rely on the hydrology has been altered. Some have been drained. Some have been ditched, and a lot of the farm ponds that you see on the landscape historically would have been spring seep wetlands that may or may not have contained bog turtles and bog turtle habitat. They're rarely encountered, even if you know where to look for them and know how to find them. They're very secretive, they're very small, they're cryptic, so they can be tough to find. And because of their endangered status, the areas that they inhabit, the known site locations are typically not disclosed to the public. So I had the the privilege to do some bog turtle work with an environmental consulting company many years ago. We were doing surveys and conservation measures, but this is a great photo here that shows what bog turtle habitat looks like: an open, emergent wetland with wetland vegetation, rushes and sedges, and very few trees. And if we zoom closer at the habitat, about an inch or two of water, mucky soils that are 10 or 12 inches, and that the hydric vegetation. This is an example of a method for bog turtle surveys. When we're looking for bog turtles, we have a survey protocol to follow that's based on so many person hours within the wetland searching. But in some of these larger wetlands, again, these are small turtles. There's a lot of habitat. So we use these what are called turtle wing traps that we would check a couple times every day to see if we could capture bog turtles. This again is a method for looking for bog turtles. They're down in that muck. They're in underwater springs and openings and gaps, and they can be very difficult to find, especially when you're looking for these little tiny hatchlings that are, the size of a quarter or a half dollar in these massive wetlands. I had the opportunity to work on bog turtle habitat and some monitoring projects where we went in and removed some of the overstory and the canopy to allow sunlight and get that early successional vegetation in that bog turtles like. We utilized a livestock grade, actually mark and put radio transmitters on turtles to locate them, track their movements, and look at nesting sites, habitat use, and ways to mitigate potential impacts if there were projects proposed to work on potential impacts to those turtles. Just some more photos here of some bog turtles with some transmitters, collecting data on them, looking at size and weight, and keeping accurate records to monitor these individuals and monitor populations over time. I mentioned earlier that unfortunately we have some non-native turtle species that have established themselves. The big one here is the red-eared slider, which is on the top left. This is a turtle that can reproduce very easily in captivity. They lay a lot of eggs. So this was a very popular turtle and still is a very popular turtle within the pet trade. And unfortunately, when people buy these things as pets, they're cute, they're the size of a quarter, and eventually these females can grow to some very big sizes. You need a bigger tank. People have released these pet turtles out into the wild, and enough of them have been released that we now have some established reproducing population. So, I can tell you that I've seen a lot of red-eared sliders throughout Pennsylvania. I've seen yellow bellies, which are on the bottom left. I believe Maryland might have some of these false map turtles on the top right established, and on the bottom right is a Florida red belly, which I'm fairly certain I've seen once or twice belong here. That may or are you losing it?
Yeah, it was just lagging for a little bit. Your audio was just starting to break up a bit, and the photo that you were discussing wasn't up on the screen yet. So right now we're seeing bog turtle habitat management and monitoring. So maybe just pause for a second just to allow that to catch up, and maybe that'll help.
All right. Sorry about that. This is the downside of living in the country when you rely on satellite internet. How are we now, and where are we at now?
No worries, Jim. Looking at right now we're on a slide that says non-native turtle species in the watershed.
Okay. All right, that's where I want to be. So these are just some examples here of non-native turtle species that have unfortunately been established. And what's happening is these turtles are competing with our native turtles, both for food resources and particularly for basking sites. Red-eared sliders grow much faster and get much bigger than our native painted turtles. And there's only, so much space on a log or a rock or somewhere to bask. And the sliders tend to outcompete painteds and will push them off and take up more space. So unfortunately, we're seeing the distribution of some of these non-natives expand. Did it go to the next one now, Adam? Can you see the threats to turtles slide?
Not quite yet. We're still looking at the non-native turtle species. We had a question in the chat too about just like maybe covering some of the photographs that were on the other slides, but we can use that as a question to maybe go back to at the end of the presentation. So we're still seeing non-native turtle species in Watershed on the screen.
Let's see. How's she look now? Threats, you got threats turtles yet?
Not yet.
All right, I'm going to try something here. If you all bear with me for a second, I apologize for this, but I'm going to try to switch over here to my mobile hotspot and see if that works better.
Sure. Yeah, and if you're
hopefully it does.
If you're able to multitask, there was a question in the chat about re-identifying these non-natives that we're still seeing up here on the screen by name.
I can do that. All right, am I back? Can you hear and see me better now?
Yeah, it actually did just switch over to the threats to turtles.
Okay. All right. I should be good to go now. Let me back up here maybe.
Yeah, and we're at 12. We're at 12:36. So if you have anything that you want to re-go over, I feel like we probably have time to.
Okay, sounds good. Could you, when I was going through these bog turtle pictures, could you see them? Bog turtle habitat.
Yeah, there was a question. We saw this bog turtle habitat slide, but there was a question about some of the, I think there were like 2 slides that had a couple of photos around the bog turtles. If you want to go back over just some of that stuff real briefly.
Is that this one here?
Yeah, at this one, and I think maybe the next one too.
Okay, yeah, this is just some examples of some of the work that I was involved in for bog turtle conservation when it comes to habitat management and monitoring of populations. Again, these turtles like open emergent wetlands with full sun, and due to forest succession, trees and canopies encroach on their habitat. So we would go in and remove a lot of that woody vegetation. We would also use livestock as a kind of a flash grazing, managed grazing as a prescription to keep these emergent wetlands open. And then we're utilizing transmitters to physically track the locations and movement patterns and habitat use of bog turtles, so we can make recommendations on habitat management and mitigation for potential impacts. So here's just some more photos with examples of data collection on these turtles, radio transmitters, and the information that we were collecting on individuals to help monitor those individuals and monitor bog turtle populations in these sites over time. And this was a slide I had on some of the non-native turtles. Top left is a red-eared slider. Bottom left is a yellow belly slider, a yellow belly cooter. Top right is a false map turtle, which I believe have some populations or a population in Maryland. And bottom right is a Florida red belly. I don't know if Florida red bellies have established themselves and are breeding, but I'm fairly certain that I've seen them out in the wild. I've seen yellow bellies as well. Okay, so now I'm gonna move on here. Hopefully it works from here on out. Let's keep our fingers crossed. Some threats to turtles. I covered this briefly in some previous slides, but development and habitat loss are the biggest issue, obviously. Vehicle strikes. I see a lot of roadkill turtles. Unfortunately, a lot of turtles are getting hit by lawnmowers. We have more nest predators on the landscape now than we did historically. Turtles are being kept as pets and collected for the pet trade, and they're obviously seeing some impacts and competition from invasive species. The picture on the bottom right is a painted turtle that's missing a limb. We catch a lot of turtles that have nubs or stumps or have some serious injuries that are maybe from a vehicle, maybe from a mower, maybe from predators at some point in their lives. But a lot of these turtles that are missing limbs or have these stumps, they seem to be able to do what they're doing, and they can sometimes live long, productive, healthy lives, even with wounds like that. So now I'm going to switch gears a little bit to some of the things that you can do to help turtles on your property. So the first, one of the easiest things to do is provide basking structures for turtles. If you have water frontage, if you have a pond, live by a lake, you can construct or build and implement your own basking structure. You can make platforms. They're basically like a little dock, just an area that the turtles can get out of the water to bask on. They need to be anchored and solid and sturdy. That way they're not flipping around. The turtles aren't sliding off, that they can physically get up on these platforms easily and slide off. So using, rebar or posts or like an anchor or weights to keep them intact, I think would be really good. A way to create basking habitat without building these structures is just allow logs and trees to remain in your ponds and creeks. I meet with a ton of landowners and a ton of farmers, and once a week somebody says, I got to clean out my creek and get the trees out of there. And as far as, for flood control, for erosion mitigation, for wildlife habitat, that is the opposite of what would be helpful. Retaining logs, retaining woody debris structures within these water habitats are wonderful for not just turtle basking structures, but for a ton of other species. And I'll show you an example of that here in a second. But if you're going to put these basking structures out, get them somewhere that they're getting full sun, especially morning sun. Turtles like to come out in the morning and bask to warm up for the day before they go do their thing. So morning sun would be really good. A lot of times they're just understand that if you're going to build these and put them out over time, they do degrade, they do kind of fall apart. So they certainly have a lifespan. Okay, and here's an example of just a homemade constructed turtle basking platform. A ton of turtles on here. I'm not 100% sure what the species are. They kind of look like yellow bellies. So I don't know if this is a picture from within the watershed or not, but just to illustrate what a homemade basking structure could look like that you could put out in your pond. Here's just some logs from a tree that fell over in the creek, and luckily nobody took a chainsaw to it and took it out because these painted turtles needed that space for basking. This would be, again, a tree that has fallen over from the shoreline, and this is providing habitat for a ton of different species, not just turtles. But again, I would encourage you to not remove this, not cut it up, not pull it out, especially if you're an angler, because you're going to have better fishing around it too. You can watch turtles and basking on it and catch bass and crappies underneath it. So that sounds like a pretty good day to me. If you have turtles nesting on your property, a relatively easy thing that you can do is implement these nest protectors. And what these do is they protect turtle eggs while they're incubating underground after they've been laid. You want to mark the location and then install these things after the turtles are finished laying their eggs. Turtles often nest in the evening, sometimes in the morning, but a lot of times in the early evenings into the night. Sometimes it takes them all night till they lay. So that's a time to be vigilant, to watch where they're nesting. Turtles do dig what are called false nests, so they don't always lay eggs in the nests that they've dug. So you want to be very vigilant to watch where they're nesting. If you see these females nesting, it's best not to handle them because they're very spooky and they're obviously trying not to get eaten during that vulnerable state. So sometimes they'll abandon nest sites, and they can even expel water out of their cloaca, which is important for them to keep either for nest digging or just for hydration. So, keep an eye from a distance, watch them, see where they lay eggs, and then attempt to install these structures. The structure should be solid. You see how this one has those rebar stakes there, keeping it in the ground, and that's good. That means that a raccoon or a skunk or a possum can't flip it over. But even though that the protection is there, the turtles are going to come out of the nest after they hatch at some point. So they need to be able to escape from these boxes. So you can see in this one, it's a really good example of there's openings there that the hatchlings can get out. And sometimes when turtles nest or when turtles hatch out of their eggs, sometimes they remain in that nest chamber over the winter and don't come out until the following spring. So if you're going to install these, turtles are nesting usually around early June 5th, 15th, something like that. So they're nesting that time period. You see them nest, install this box. The hatchlings either hatch in the fall of that year, August and September, or they'll hatch and hang out in that nest cavity until the following spring. So best to leave these things in until the following spring. If my biggest takeaway, I think, from this presentation today, if there's anything that you want to do for turtles, or you have friends or family, something that you can recommend, the best way to help turtles is just to reduce mowing. This is something that we stress almost every day in our technical outreach stuff to farmers and landowners. Just mow less. Don't mow as frequently as you would. If you have grasslands, you don't have to mow them once a week all summer. You could let them grow up in grass and mow them in the wintertime to impede succession. That way the turtles are going to be underground and hibernating. If you must mow, you can set your mower deck up high. There's nothing wrong with having a field of 10-inch grass. If you want to mow it to control thistle or invasives or woody vegetation, you can, but set that mower deck up high that you know you'll be missing turtles. But there's still an opportunity or potential for running over turtles with tires. So watch where you're going and look before you mow. Look to see if you have any box turtles out in your field or any nesting turtles that day. And if you can, just stop mowing altogether. If you have areas where you're just mowing to keep it open or just mowing it for looks, just ask yourself, do I need to mow this? Why am I mowing this? And if you don't have a good reason other than, subjectively thinking it looks good, maybe think about the other organisms that are using it and relying on this habitat that don't want it to be a manicured lawn. And, again, if I'm not encouraging people to stop mowing completely forever, because then these meadows, grassland, early successional habitats will revert to forest, and a lot of times invasive species will come in. But there are ways, again, I'm just trying to encourage you not to mow 3 times a week all summer. That there's definitely some adjustments to our mowing regimen that we can make to benefit turtles and other grassland and early successional species. I love showing these pictures in presentations that I do when I'm trying to tell people to stop mowing, because this, unfortunately, the society and culture that we live in, we look at a landscape that's mowed and that's clean, and we think that looks good. Where if there's grass growing around the edges or in the ditches, or a field that's unmowed, we think, wow, that looks terrible, and somebody needs to get to that and clean it up. And we're really trying to change that perception and encourage people to not mow, that you just don't have to constantly mow large areas, large swaths. Again, this doesn't necessarily apply to small residential landowners, developments, small homes, but if you have significant acreage, fields, woods, meadows that you're just mowing to keep clean, we may not have to do that. This seems like a no-brainer, but it's really not. I drive a lot for work and travel, and I see craziness on the roads every single day. Just slow down while you're driving. People that ride with me in the summertime complain because I'm slamming on the brakes all the time, because I'm pretty much looking for turtles all the time while I'm driving, which I don't recommend that either, because that can become dangerous. But at least if you're out there, especially on rural back roads, especially during the spring nesting season, when these turtles are crossing roads, just drive a little slower, be careful. Anyone who's spent time in some of the coastal communities, especially in New Jersey and Maryland, knows that there's a big initiative to raise awareness about terrapin nesting sites down there. There's signs, there's certain times when the speed limits are changed to protect nesting turtles. So just be careful while you're on the roads. If you find turtles crossing a road and you want to move them in the direction that they're headed, because if you move them back, they're just going to, they know where they want to go. They're trying to do their thing, and they're just going to try to come back the same direction. I know that's not always feasible. When there's structures and when there's stuff, along the side of the road that they can't get through, but do your best if you can. And, don't relocate them, especially box turtles, to different areas because they're familiar with the area that they grew up in. So they want to remain within their home range and their territory. If you have significant acreage and you need some financial incentives or financial assistance to help better manage that for turtles or for any other species, there's a ton of programs that are available now through nonprofits like us, through federal government and through state governments that allow you to better manage the habitat on your property for wildlife. There are easements out there, there's wetland restoration practices, and all three of these agencies that I listed will help you. They'll basically for free write habitat management plans or conservation plans for your property. And whether it's for turtles or for another species, I would encourage you, again, if you have significant land holdings, to contact us or reach out to one of these agencies to get help managing your property. Another really good practice or something that you can implement would be what I would call like a vegetated buffer area. We all know that a lot of these aquatic turtles reside in ponds, reside in lakes, swamps, wetlands, but depending on the species, some of them really rely on those upland adjacent habitats next to the wetlands. So I mentioned spotted turtles and their seasonal movements, wood turtles moving across the landscape, box turtles, obviously, but even our aquatic turtles sometimes make forays or overland movements and can very easily be hit by a car or not be able to find food or get mowed up. So by managing and protecting these buffer type areas, this can really be beneficial for protecting smaller isolated populations and for dispersing turtles that are going between two different populations. So again, increase that habitat, mow less. That ugly, messy look may look bad to us, but these wildlife species love it, and that's what they have evolved to utilize, and they need that to complete their basic biology and life history strategy. So again, if you're interested in doing something like this, please contact us, and if we're not able to help you, we can certainly put you in touch with another agency or organization that can. As far as what we're doing, our Alliance Forest team here in Pennsylvania, we're focusing on reforestation efforts. I want to say since our program started in 2018, we've planted about 650 acres of buffers along streams in the Pennsylvania's portion of the watershed. We'll do some upland plantings, lawn conversion plantings, and again, more trees, more forest. We have healthier, more productive ecosystems, and we're meeting our mission by enhancing and protecting our water resources both locally and in the Bay. And we're also creating this good habitat for turtles and other species. You think of these areas along creeks that are completely devoid of vegetation. Once they're reforested, you have a better ecosystem within the creek for things like map turtles on the bottom left, and you have more foraging and habitat that eventually is not being mowed, not being impacted by farming for things like wood turtles on the bottom right. So I think that's all I have. I apologize for the technical difficulties there. I know I went a little long, but I have time. If anybody has questions, I guess I'll turn it back over to Adam.
Yeah, thanks, Jim. We do have a couple of minutes here till 1 o'clock, and we can start asking some of the questions that were coming in, or start answering some of the questions that were coming in via the chat. I did hear from headquarters that we're willing to change the tagline to "For our forests, for our streams, for our turtles." So
great.
Got to head it in the right direction there. So why is basking so important to turtles, Jim?
So I mentioned earlier about how, didn't want to go through there. I'm having more technical difficulties now. So basking is important because turtles are ectotherms. So, think of the old term cold-blooded, where their metabolism and their body temperature relies on their external environment. So if they eat food, they don't have, the homeostasis or the metabolism internally like we do that can digest that food. So they'll need to go bask and collect that sunlight, warm their body temperature up so that they can do their metabolic processes for simple things like digestion. So, and different basking is important to a different degree for different species. Things like snapping turtles stink pots, mud turtles, they don't have to bask much because they can get up to the temperature and do what they need to do just by, being in a water with ambient temperature. Whereas some of our pond turtles, like our painteds, maps, red bellies, they do a lot more basking to warm themselves. So it's about thermoregulation, and it's about keeping their metabolism up to speed because they're ectothermic.
Jim, do you know if climate change is having any effects on turtle basking, or if there are like maximum temperatures that we reach where they will have trouble basking or need to bask significantly less?
Generally speaking, no, I don't really know the answer to that question. There certainly are critical temperatures and temperature thresholds where reptiles won't bask all day. It can get too hot for them, whether it's a rattlesnake on a rock or a painted turtle on a rock. They if it's too hot, it's just like us, where we can be too hot and they need to do something to cool off. As far as how climate change is affecting the basking itself, I don't know. My guess is southern distributed species are going to continue to trend and push north, just like mammals and birds, based on latitude and where where the climate is at that point. But as far as how it's going to affect populations, that I don't know.
When you see the trail of bubbles kind of coming up around like still water, slower water, is that typically turtles that are down there on the bottom moving around?
Typically, no, but it can be. A lot of times when you see those bubbles coming to the surface, those are probably gases that are escaping from the organic matter, detritus, or mud on the bottom, where bacteria and other protists and other pathogens or whatever are breaking down those substances, and they're releasing some kind of gas, and that's coming to the surface. So most of the time, that's what it's from. However, if a big snapping turtle is walking across the bottom of a pond or a lake, it can, because it's heavy and it's compressing some of that organic matter, the bubbles can be released that are being held in that muck and come to the surface. So if you see that could be an indication that there's a turtle at the bottom, but yet muskrats and otters and some other things will do the same thing. So generally speaking, usually those bubbles aren't turtles, but they could potentially be.
I'm going to ask a two-parter here. We have somebody that's got 8+ acres of forest that could support box turtles, but they're surrounded by development and roads. Do you have any suggestions for keeping them in the forest? And then if that person is successful and there's a whole variance of box turtle color patterns within those 8 acres, do you know what causes the variance in box turtle color patterns?
All species have some level of genetic variation, some obviously more so than others. Now, why box turtle patterns are so diverse, I don't really know the question or the answer to that. I'm not sure what the mechanism is that causes that, or what the advantage would be to being that diverse as far as the different colors and patterns, because just from a conceptual standpoint, over time, usually those things drift in one direction based on, the concept of natural selection, which is whatever is suited better to survive and reproduce will be the dominant trait within that population. And that does not seem to be the case, at least to this point, with box turtles. So I don't really have a good answer for that. As far as managing habitat, or what that individual can do to manage their property better for box turtles, I would say probably invasive species management would be the best thing to do, because box turtles have evolved to utilize and eat our native flora and fauna here. And if the natives are being outcompeted by invasives, it may be more difficult for the box turtles to forage, to find food, and the food that they're eating may not be as nutritious as the stuff that they've evolved to utilize. So I would say, address invasive species, replant or reseed with natives, and just manage your forest to be productive. Again, keep it intact. Don't develop it. Don't drive through there with 4-wheelers more than you have to. Don't mow more than you have to, or mow in the wintertime. Again, just be vigilant and conscious of what's there and why you're doing what you're doing. And hopefully an 8 acres is pretty small, but it's not impossible for a little population to hang on in there. It would be pretty tough, but hopefully it works for them.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much, Jim. We're almost at 1 o'clock. There are some additional questions, and we'll capture those, and maybe we can forward them to you. And if there's a couple answers that you can include in our email that we'll send out tomorrow, we could answer a few of them that way. So that is a helpful reminder. Again, if there's information from this presentation that you're looking forward to revisiting, you will receive a link to watch the presentation again in your email inboxes tomorrow. So, Jim, thanks for spending your time with us here this afternoon. Lots of fascinating information. Thanks so much to everybody who joined us, not only for this presentation, but for all of our Ask the Alliance presentations this year. We just really appreciate you all joining us to learn from our team of experts. So have a wonderful afternoon. And on behalf of the Alliance for the Chesapeake Bay, just thanks so much for joining us. Thanks, Jim.
Thanks, everyone.